Welcome to this episode of the Business of Practice podcast, where we focus on the financial and human sides of equine veterinary medicine. In this episode, Amy Grice, VMD, MBA, is going to talk to us about employment agreements. Dr. Grice practiced for more than 20 years before starting veterinary business consulting. She advises veterinarians and practice owners on a wide variety of projects and challenges. The Business of Practice podcast is brought to you by Dechra Veterinary Products. Welcome to the podcast, Dr. Grice.
Hi, it's so nice to be here.
Well, this is a very important topic on employment agreements. And I guess my first question to get you started is, why should we have written employment agreements, whether you're the owner of the practice hiring someone or someone being hired?
Well, it's so important to have expectations spelled out clearly, and that really prevents misunderstandings, disagreements. As we get older, and even sometimes when we're younger, we don't have the best memory of the conversations that we have. And so having things in writing can really help, when you're saying, gosh, what did we say about that? And you can go and look it up. It really protects both practice owners as well as associates.
And what do you think are the key elements of an agreement that both sides of the agreement should have in there and cover?
Well, the first is really the length or the term of the agreement or the contract. Some of them have a distinctive term, whether that's 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, but others go on in perpetuity until a change is made. And so that's one of the important elements. Another would be compensation, benefits that are going to be provided, duties that are going to be required, whether that includes emergency duty or not, the schedule to a certain degree. But what's important to remember is that these are, because it's a legal document, a lot of times these things are sort of in generalities. And so an associate looking at their first contract might be a little confused when it might say hours that are typical for the industry and think, oh my God, what am I getting in for? But gosh, when you think about it from the owner's point of view, what if they get kicked by a horse and have a broken leg, but their contractual agreement with their associate is so many hours or so many days a week or so many emergency shifts, and yet all of a sudden they need to ask that person to step up temporarily for the practice. And so that's why many times these will not be super, super specific, but will actually have more general language. One of the important things is a non-compete clause, and we can talk a little bit more about that because that's a big topic. And then also under what conditions termination would take place and what that would look like.
Well, let's go back, because I know one of the issues in our industry, especially with young veterinarians starting out, is compensation. So how do owners and new vets, and maybe I'm talking about new vets out of vet school now. I realize veterinarians may change practices farther into their careers, but new vets is what I'm talking about. So how do they negotiate compensation that's fair to both?
Well, generally, when a new veterinarian is entering the equine veterinary space, the owner of the practice realizes that newly graduated veterinarian is not probably going to be able to produce new amounts of revenue for the practice for several years sometimes. They will be sharing work that the owner will be sharing work, or other associates will be sharing work that normally has been done by others. And then as the practice grows, that associate will grow into attracting new clients, bringing in new business through perhaps skills that they have that others in the practice don't have. And they will find themselves suddenly being able to make more production than when they first began. And so an owner is investing in a new veterinarian and actually taking some of their profits to support that new veterinarian's salary for their first year and sometimes 2 years. So compensation is generally a salary or a base salary with the opportunity to earn additional monies when the revenue production is over and above what would support that salary. Occasionally, you'll see people being paid straight commission, but that's unusual. Usually what I'm seeing these days is simply a salary or a salary with a production bonus.
Okay. And when you start talking about duties and work schedules, and I'm going to include emergency work schedules in there, what is it that both sides should be looking for to negotiate a contract that's good for both of them?
Well, generally, you want to have some balance between the associates and the owners of the practice with regard to who is taking care of emergency duty. And some of the practices have gotten used to being able to hire associates whenever they wanted, when there was a big supply of associates, but there's not anymore. And so having sort of an equal distribution of the responsibilities of emergency duty can be important. Just thinking back to our previous little question about compensation, one of the things I always encourage people to do is to negotiate for some additional monies for perhaps as part of the emergency fee, not the whole bill for the emergency, but the fee for getting out of bed at 2 a.m. and going somewhere. And so if you have a particularly bad weekend and you see 12 or 13 cases and you're just working, dawn to into the dark for 2 days in a row and you see lots of cases, doesn't it feel better if you know that you're counting up, oh, that's $100 every time I do an emergency? Maybe that weekend you made $1,300 or $1,400 extra dollars. It really helps to keep your attitude feeling a little more chipper about it. There's also sometimes at some practices a difference in compensation for revenues earned for, say, selling pharmacy items, retail, selling a bag of vet wrap or some trimethoprim sulfa pills, that you either get no commission on that at all, or you get a smaller commission, because with online pharmacy sales so prevalent now, practices cannot afford to be paying a big percentage on those retail pharmacy sales. And so that's another little thing to mention about compensation.
And what seems to be the norm now for vacation and other types of leave, including maternity leave, that equine practices are offering now?
So it depends on the practice. You'll see a wide variety of amount of time that is paid time off, basically, or time allowed away from the practice, depending on how the compensation works. Most practices do not have formal paid maternity leave, but most practices allow a period of time for veterinarians to be absent from the practice while keeping their job open and waiting for them to come back to. And these practices also typically continue to pay for benefits like a health insurance policy while that person is out on unpaid leave. And most will allow an associate veterinarian to save up, say, vacation days or sick days, even from a previous year, if they're planning a pregnancy, to try and get a bank of paid days to help them a little bit. Depending on the size of the practice, the industry in some multi-doctor practices will offer somewhere between 2 and 4 weeks of vacation, depending on the number of years that veterinarian has worked for the practice. Perhaps 5 sick or personal days, and some time to go to continuing education without eating into their vacation or personal time.
You had mentioned benefits, and you have done several articles for Equimanagement and given talks throughout the veterinary industry. And I'm going to list some of the benefits that you have mentioned that could be covered in a contract. Professional liability insurance, professional licenses, membership such as to AAEP, continuing education, health insurance, disability insurance, a retirement plan, sick and personal days, discounted services, and maternity leave. So when you're negotiating a contract, whether you're the employer or the employee, how do you determine which of these is most important that you work on in your contract, and what are you seeing in contracts these days?
Well, one of the things to remember is that when an employee, a veterinarian, an associate, has to pay for these things out of after-tax dollars, it really diminishes their pay, their compensation. And so the more benefits that the practice can offer, which are tax deductible to the practice, the better off it is for the associate. There used to be a standard sort of business management percentage of total gross revenue produced by an employee veterinarian that should not be exceeded by all the expenses of their employment. Okay, so that would include their salary, payroll taxes, workman's comp, and all of their benefits. And the previous figure was 25%. All of those costs should not exceed 25%. Because we now have really a shortage of people coming into equine veterinary medicine, Marcia Hankey, Dr. Hankey, reported at the 2020 AAEP convention that amount has gone up to 28%. And so we're seeing practices needing to use some of their profits to support more compensation for veterinarians. And so if you have a practice that provides very few benefits, then if they are providing compensation of a percentage of revenue production, that percentage is going to be higher. It's going to be closer to 28%. The more benefits are offered, the lower that percentage will be. So you might see somebody who's got a nice health insurance plan, a $1,500 CE benefit, their PLIT, their memberships, and those licenses are all paid. You might see that person being offered, say, 24 or 25% of their gross revenue production as their production bonus amount, basically. And so the practice that doesn't offer any of that is going to need to compensate those people much more highly because they now have to pay for those things which are necessary out of after-tax dollars.
Dechra Veterinary Products is proud to sponsor Equimanagement's The Business of Practice podcast. Dechra's equine product line includes Osphos, clonidine injection, Orthokine Vet IRAP 10 and 60, Osteokine PRP, Equidone Gel, Domperidone, the Vetivex line of parenteral fluids, Vicox EQ joint supplement, and a comprehensive line of topical dermatologic products. The recent addition of Zymeta, diaperone injection, further expands Dechra's equine offerings. For more information about Dechra's products, please visit dechra-us.com. And I know one of the things that was discussed at an AAP meeting was vehicles, because if a new associate has to come out and supply their own practice vehicle, that can really be tough on them the first few years. So what are you seeing in contracts today about vehicle use?
Well, it's interesting that you bring that up. Dr. Colon did a really nice presentation at that AAEP meeting and had a lot of very interesting information about that. Certainly, if an associate veterinarian chooses a fairly fuel efficient, smaller vehicle that does not have high costs, both insurance costs, gas costs, repair costs, and initial purchase costs, they can actually do better taking a mileage reimbursement. But if they have a big gas guzzling, giant 3/4 ton pickup truck or Suburban like I like to drive, well, you're much more comfortable. You're in it all damn day. You want it to be cushy because you spend most of your life in it, right? In those cases, it's better for the associate to be provided a vehicle. And so it really depends on what the vehicle is. When I see practices having contracts, and the vast majority provide a vehicle. And I think in part that can come down to, in a bigger multi-doctor practice, to branding, that you want to be able to control what the brand identity, the appearance of your doctor showing up. You don't really want them showing up necessarily in, an old Toyota with the tailgate held on with duct tape, or, it's a brand identity thing. So I see most practices providing vehicles, and it is an expense that they can write off.
So a lot of people coming out of vet school have never really had to negotiate a contract before. And I've heard some of them even say, I didn't know I was supposed to negotiate. I thought this is what they offered and I could either take it or leave it. So what is your advice to not only the veterinarians coming out of school, the new associate, but to the practices to help this negotiation work out to the best of both parties?
Well, especially now when it's hard to attract and retain associates, I think that practice owners need to approach contract negotiation as a truly win-win kind of conversation. So they need to find out what is most important to that associate in keeping them happy. And that really means asking them, what is the most important thing? Is it compensation? Is it time off? Is it professional skill acquisition? The ability to do the kinds of work that excite you? Finding that out ahead of time and trying to craft an employment agreement that allows for everybody's needs is probably the most important thing for the practice owner to think about. For those that are coming out and having their first experience with an employment agreement, I think the best piece of advice I can give is, this is a negotiation. You have a lot of power. If there's something in there that you really feel uncomfortable about, you need to ask about it, talk about it, and remember it's a conversation between two adults that neither one is under pressure to sign. Okay, it's like fair market value, which is, the price that a willing buyer and a willing seller come to. Okay, when nobody is under any pressure. So the same thing is true about your contract.
And I think, speaking of that, I have had some veterinarian friends who, had a 1 year or 2 year or whatever contract, and that came and went. And the owner of the practice they never renegotiated a contract. So basically, the veterinarian was just working. And they were working under the old terms, but there was nothing in it that said, after the 12-month, 24-month, whatever was in the contract. And so what does that mean? When do you revisit your contract, whether it's a 1 year, 3 year, in perpetuity? I mean, what are you looking for to renegotiate?
I think it's really important that in every practice, no matter what the length of term of the employment agreement, that the employer and the employee sit down once a year and talk about whether both of their needs are being met, whether both are satisfied with what's happening. Because I think a lot of times when those conversations do not take place, resentments build. People listen to, they believe what they're thinking, and everything you think is not true. And so it's so important to have those conversations about what your dreams are for your career, that you really want to go get certified in acupuncture, or you really want to attend ISELP, and or the owner thinking, gosh, I really want to stop doing so many emergency shifts. I'm feeling old and tired. Having those conversations is so important, and they should happen at a minimum once a year. And that's a perfect opportunity to talk about changing the expectations of the employment agreement.
And what else, in your experience working with young veterinarians and with practices, would you want to bring up about employment agreements?
The non-competes. Non-compete clauses are creating a lot of trouble in the industry. And, it comes from many different sides. One is that this practice owner who has invested in a new graduate, taken part of their profits in order to support that salary while that person is getting up to speed, honestly, feels terrible if that person, up and leaves after they've invested in them and have never had a chance to recoup their investment. And so from their point of view, having a non-compete seems like incredibly reasonable. On the other hand, you have folks coming into the equine industry that have high educational loans. They often are female and have a spouse that has, gotten a job. They've had, maybe bought a house. And suddenly, if things aren't working out at that particular employment, they're kind of stuck. If their non-compete is of a great distance, or a long term, or there's no opportunity to buy it out. And what are their choices? They go to small animal medicine. They don't really have a lot of choices. And so it can break people's dreams, and they can feel trapped and like they have no other choice but to leave equine practice. And that's what we're trying not to do, is have people leave equine practice. And so we recently had a roundtable about employment contracts for AAEP, and an attorney, Frank Muggia from New Jersey, he works with Harris Beach, talked with us about non-competes. And he said that when judges look at these, they want to protect the goodwill of the practice. But they won't give a protection to a practice that practice couldn't get in the marketplace. So most judges feel that to reestablish goodwill after somebody leaves is, no more than 6 months. Because if you have been in practice a long time, you have a strong brand, just because this person has been here, it shouldn't be hurting your business so much. Most non-competes that will hold up in court are those that utilize current clients or current particular stables rather than a radius of distance. And so current clients is the type of non-compete that's going to be much more enforceable. The other thing that I'm seeing more and more is that practices are providing an opportunity for associates to buy out their non-compete contractually in the employment agreement if they find that they need to or wish to leave the practice.
And speaking of buyouts, what part of the agreement should be in writing in this employment contract to allow that veterinarian at some point to buy into the practice?
Well, in my opinion, there should not really ever be a promise of buy-in in a contract. And that could be a controversial statement because so many associates have been promised eventual buy-in. And then when the rubber hits the road, that owner doesn't want to share their profits. They want to continue profiting off the associate. And that is when associates get fed up and leave. But it's not something that you want to put into a contract, because a bad partnership is like a bad marriage. And so, do you really want to contractually be obligated to marry someone that you actually don't even at that point even really like? Probably not. But there again goes to those annual conversations where the associate says, it's very important to me to be an owner of a practice. When do you foresee me being able to buy in? Because I would like to own 25% of this practice by the end of 2022, or I'm going to really feel the need to look at other options. Those sort of very clear, honest, transparent conversations have to take place, and they have to have dates attached to them, not this, in 2 years, and then in 2 years it's in 2 years, and 2 years later it's in 2 years. That doesn't work.
Yeah. Is there any recommendation to have an attorney, a CPA, or someone else review your contract before you sign it?
Absolutely. It's incredibly important to, especially those that are dealing with their first employment agreement, to have someone have a look at it. Very best case scenario, you have an attorney look at it, or somebody knowledgeable, a mentor, a business consultant. I look at a bunch of them for new graduates because sometimes it's very quick and simple, and sometimes it is alarming. It's alarming that people have actually obviously written their own agreement without any attorney's help, and it's very easy to say, do not sign this thing at all. I mean, it's scary what I see sometimes. But yes, having help is a very good idea.
And what other points would you like to cover on agreements?
Really, I think that agreements are a wonderful way to set expectations, but they do not take away the need for ongoing, clear, and honest communication on a regular basis between employer and employee. They both need to understand what the other one's vision is for the future, what their dreams are, what they hope that will happen, so that they can plan a future together or have a more sort of thoughtful way to part ways, if that's what's going to happen.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Grice. As usual, some very on-spot, on-topic recommendations that I think both sides of a contract agreement will find benefit from. And we want to thank our audience for joining us on the Business Practice Podcast, and a big thanks to our sponsor, Dechra Veterinary Products. Please visit equimanagement.com or your favorite podcast network such as iTunes, SoundCloud, or Stitcher to hear every episode of the Business of Practice. And if you have any questions or suggestions, you can send an email to me at kbrown@equinenetwork.com. The Business of Practice Podcast is a production of the Equine Podcast Network, an entity of the Equine Network, LLC.